Welcome to our mini masterclass with Thomas Wartenberg. Tom had taught philosophy for decades, I'm assuming, Tom, at Mount Holyoke, specializing in German philosophy and Kant and all sorts of incomprehensible writers whom he made very clear to his eager undergraduates. He also wrote a lot about the philosophy of film. He's most recently been interested in the philosophy of art. He did a master class for us, though, on a project that he did for many years, which I had a personal love for, which was teaching philosophy to young children through the use of picture books. And our master class was philosophy through the picture books of William Steig. And if you do not know the works of William Steig, you are woefully uneducated. He's one of the great writers and storytellers of all time. In the evaluations of that master class, someone said that they had a fairly firm grounding of philosophy when they went into that class, but now they have vivid, lovely images to attach to ideas. And that seems similar to what you're about to do for these teachers today, Tom. Thank you for being here. These teachers have had an incredibly rough few months, rougher than I think those of us who aren't in the classroom, even if we're not in the classroom, have had, and especially in the last week, it's just gotten worse. So we're here for a little intellectual joy. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Thomas, for doing this. Enjoy the class.
Okay, thank you, Sam. I want to say I approached Sam about doing the class because I started trying to figure out if there's anything that I could do to try to help out. It's a really difficult time because I'm not teaching anymore, and so I didn't have to deal with all the things that you all are dealing with and that many of my former colleagues are dealing with. And so we decided we'd talk about art, and in particular conceptual art. And so what I'm going to do now is start up a PowerPoint. And I should say I've only done one of these virtual sessions before, so bear with me if there are issues. So as Sam was telling you, I've gotten very interested in art and the idea that art can convey philosophical ideas. The idea in my work on film and in my work with picture books, I've been struck by both how films and picture books are ripe with philosophical ideas. And so I wanted, actually, partly because of what happened when we brought the, so I taught a course where my college students went into an elementary school and taught philosophy to the kids using picture books. And we would bring the students who were basically all Black and Hispanic up to the college because I was thinking that it would be a way of getting them to think of college as appropriate for them. And we took them on a tour, and one of the places we went was the art museum, and the kids loved to talk about the art. And that got me thinking about the relationship between art and philosophy in a more systematic way. And so I developed, among other things, a website called Philosophy at the Virtual Art Museum. And as you can see, there's a number of different genres or art forms that the website has on it. If we have time, I can show you more about it. But in talking about this, we decided that the conceptual art would be a good place to have a discussion, partly because people don't like conceptual art and are puzzled by it. So it raises lots of interesting questions that hopefully we'll be able to discuss with one another today. So the first thing that I wanted to do is to ask the basic philosophical question, what is conceptual art? And I'm going to answer this. We're going to look at an answer this that was proposed by one of the important conceptual artists. Actually, before I get to that, I should just say that as an artistic movement that was self-conscious and called itself conceptual art only existed in the 1960s and 1970s. But more broadly speaking, since you've looked at a couple of images that weren't from that time period, more broadly, that it's an art form that started in the early 20th century, and there are plenty of conceptual artists now still working. But Saul LeWitt was one of the first conceptual artists, and here's how he characterized, this is a very famous quote, and so I thought I'm just going to read it. In conceptual art, the idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. Okay, remember that sentence, because that's going to be one that we keep coming back to, right? The idea or concept is the most important aspect of the work. When an artist, he goes on, uses a conceptual form of art, it means that all of the planning and decisions are made beforehand and the execution is a perfunctory affair. The idea becomes a machine that makes the art. Now, I want to separate that claim off because actually I don't think that's true of all conceptual art, but I'll explain why I think he said it. So I don't know if you're familiar with Saul LeWitt at all, but he's very well known. Why can't I move my PowerPoint forward? How about there? Okay, so he's well known for what are called wall drawings. And so this wall drawing he had the idea for this wall drawing in 1976, which is the same year that he wrote that statement that I just read you. And this is his 289th wall drawing. And all he does is comes up with a set of instructions. So it says fourth wall, 24 lines from the center, 12 lines from the midpoint of each of the sides, 12 lines from each corner. Okay, so that's the idea behind the work. And then usually a team of people, by this time he was famous and had a group of technicians, he called them, who would actually create the art. There it is. So this has been reproduced many times. If you Google it, you'll be able to see lots of different versions, because one of the interesting things is that the instructions are so incomplete that it really just depends on what people do, and you get very, very different images that are all examples. They're all instantiations of those instructions. This one was from, I think it's from the Whitney Museum, and it's a little weird because it has that background of sort of a graph paper or something like that, which is not exactly there in the instructions, but it's not precluded either. So there it is. And if you just count, you can see that, the people who made it have actually, you can't see me point, I got to use this thing. You can see that the people who made it have actually created a certain number of lines, but now it doesn't say how long the lines have to be or anything. So that's all up to individual decisions. And that sort of contradicts his idea that it's just a machine, right? That there's no skill or effort going into actually creating this. I think it actually requires that. But in any case, this is just sort of to explain to you why he says what he does about the idea being the essence and then the execution just being a purely mechanical process. So what I now want to do is we're going to look at the three works that you have already looked at, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit. But before we do that, I wanted to just show you and have you think a little bit about a more traditional work of art that also has a connection to philosophy. This is by Jacques-Louis David. It's called The Death of Socrates. It's from 1787. As you probably know, Socrates was condemned to death by the Athenians. It's not quite true because he chose it, right? His sentence was exile or death. But he did the best he could, and it's one of Plato's dialogues. Plato, by the way, that's Plato there. In one of Plato was his student, and the picture that we have of Socrates as a philosopher comes to a large extent from some of his early dialogues. And one of them, the Crito, actually is this one. It talks about his death, and Socrates explains why he wouldn't go into exile. But none of that really makes that much difference. What I just wanted you to do is to look at this and think about what what's the most striking feature of the painting for you? And anybody who wants to can say something.
Yeah, if you'd like, please just go ahead and use your space bar, which will unmute you for the time you'd like to speak.
I think probably really striking is the posture of Plato in the center of the bed with his outstretched arm and his outstretched leg kind of in opposition to each
Okay, it's Socrates actually. But...
Sorry.
Okay.
Oh wait, can I answer you?
Patricia?
Yes. What struck me at first are the draping and the clothing or lack of clothing, and his being revealed by his wrap, his toga, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel, jump in.
So there's also the hemlock. The bowl of hemlock is right in the center of the composition, and then Plato and Socrates are kind of isolated or by the fact that they're both wearing sort of white or monochromatic clothing, and everything else is sort of darker colored.
I would also say the sadness of everyone else except Socrates.
Can you hear me? Because I understand my mic is worked here. He's really quoting the visual with kind of Pompeii. Obviously, it was rediscovered just shortly after that, so the flatness and everything. So to me, it's very interesting because he's quoting these classical kind of thoughts philosophically, meanings, but also quoting the classical language visually.
Yeah, okay, so you've all pointed out really important features about the painting. It's also, I just want to say, it's also, it seems to me it's a very dramatic painting, right? Even if you don't know exactly what Socrates is saying, the fact that he's standing there, like, you know, with his hand up, he's making a gesture where he's emphasizing something. And aside from Plato, who just seems depressed, everybody else seems, you know, very emotional. And, you know, this is the death of Socrates, who was an important, you know, he's not the first philosopher, but he's sort of crucial in the history of philosophy. So, okay, so then it's a very, in many ways, a very traditional painting. It's beautiful, you know, it's very skillfully done and has, you know, the draperies, their clothes are done beautifully rendered, nice colors, very interesting composition. Somebody pointed out, right, the hemlock right at the center of the composition. So, okay, so we're now going to go from that, and it's easy for us to understand why this would be considered a great painting, right? It's subject matter, its execution, all of that. And so when we contrast it with this, it's a really stark contrast. So again, Joseph Kosuth is one of the early conceptual artists. Interestingly, this is called 1 and 3 chairs. One of the questions that I have still is why that's the title of it. The 3 isn't so hard, but what's the 1 about? So this is actually an installation, so it's not a painting. So we have here a photograph of the installation, but the installation consisted of a very ordinary folding chair placed against a wall. There is a large photograph of that very chair mounted on the wall. It's life-size. And then here is a dictionary definition of a chair. And this isn't exactly the same one, but as you can see, I mean, one of the interesting things about the concept chair is that it's ambiguous. It's got multiple meanings, and the one that's relevant here is a seat with a back and often arms used for one person. Okay, so in some sense, it's clear why there are 3 chairs, right? They're the definition of a chair, the picture, the photograph of a chair, and the actual chair. And so the question is, if we take LeWitt's claim seriously that the important part of a work like this as a conceptual work is the idea behind it, the question is, what is the idea behind this work? I'm not going to torture you and ask you to do it. I'm going to tell you what I think, okay? So in our small group, one of the participants mentioned that it sort of reminded them of Plato's metaphysics, and it seems to me is right on point. So Plato develops a metaphysics. So metaphysics, for those of you who might not know, is a sort of branch of philosophy that attempts to give a theory about the structure of the world, what types of things there are in the world. And Plato is famous for what's called the theory of forms. And the idea of the theory of forms is that the things that we normally take to be real, right, in our everyday lives, like tables and chairs, he says those are not real. They're merely appearances of the underlying reality, which is the forms, or the earlier translation used to be ideas. The Greek word is eidos. And they're real because they are essentially what the thing is. And so the other part of his theory is that works of art, like a painting, or he didn't know about photographs because they weren't invented yet, but a photograph of a chair is, not only is it an appearance, right, something that's not really real, but it's the appearance of an appearance. So it's doubly unreal. And so Plato used this as a critique of art. So here's a quote from the Republic. Well, then it turns out that there are 3 kinds of beds. He wasn't talking about chairs, but beds. Hopefully you can make the transfer. One exists in nature. I suppose we should say God created it. So that's the real bed. And then the bed the carpenter made, that's the physical bed, and that's the appearance of the bed. And the one made by the painter, which is the appearance of an appearance. And so that's just the articulation of his metaphysics, right? The 3 categories of the being of the chair, right? There are 3 chairs in the work, and they match Plato's 3 different categories here. But then he goes on and says the imitator, right, the painter or the photographer, the artist, the one who creates illusions, does not understand reality, but only what reality appears to be. So Plato is critical of artists as opposed to philosophy, because the artist is concerned merely with appearances, the way things look, and not with their reality. So what Kosuth has done, so then the question becomes, what is Kosuth saying about Plato? Right. So for a long time, I thought all he was doing was illustrating Plato's metaphysics, right? But when you put this, right, he's illustrating Plato's metaphysics by showing us the 3 dimensions of reality according to Plato. But when you put this in the context of conceptual art and Plato's criticism of the arts, you realize that actually what Kosuth has done is to say, against Plato, art doesn't just deal with appearances, it deals with reality just as much as philosophy does. Because I can make a work of art that presents a metaphysical view. So I, as an artist, am not merely a creator of illusions. I'm as much a philosopher as the philosophers. And in fact, Kosuth himself thought that 20th century philosophy has sort of abdicated its role as really talking about important issues. And in his writing, he thought that art would come to take the place of philosophy. And so this particular piece, I think, is a good example of that. So because of the difficulty, I think, of understanding this work, I wanted to talk about it, but I'm going to let you guys talk more now, because we're going to look at Rene Magritte's The Treachery of Images from 1929.
Before we go on, could, Tom, sorry to stop you. Rachel had her hand up. I wonder if we could let Rachel jump in for a moment.
So I would love to also talk about the idea of, in sort of the reverse of what you're representing in terms of metaphysics, the idea of the complication of language. So by including a definition of a chair that has multiple meanings, and then the photograph, which can represent a chair as the thing we sit in, but also as all of these other things, thus speaking to the kind of intrinsic misunderstanding in the word or the spoken word, right? Or the fact that language is always trying to pinpoint what it's actually meaning. And then you get closer to the object with the photograph because it clarifies which chair we're actually talking about. But by definition, it's just an image which is unusable. So the object without use is not actually the object. And then we move back to what, the truth of the object with the chair, the functional chair sitting there, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I was actually surprised that I can't really read this one, so I can't see if, I can only see a one, so I don't know if there's multiple meanings. It's just so blurry in all the different images I got that I couldn't really see it. But, the Platonic idea is that actually the form of the chair has to say what it is that makes the chair the type of thing that it is. So it is very much like a definition. So using a dictionary definition as the sort of symbol for the Platonic idea seems to me pretty interesting. Yeah, I wish, it's hard with these works. There's another work by him that I tried to get. The Brooklyn Museum had it. This was before COVID, but I asked them if it was possible to see it, and they said, no, it's too much work for us to show it to you. So I assume with this one too, it would be very hard to let you see it because it's probably, the different parts of it are probably sitting in a storage room somewhere, and they won't bring it out just for me. With some works of art, they'll actually let you see them, even if they're not on display, but not with this one. So I'm just saying I'm not sure whether there's multiple meanings in that definition or not. But I think those are interesting comments about the relationship between language. I mean, for Plato, I think language is just the way of getting to the ideas. And language becomes much more important in 20th century philosophy. And that's a good transition, since you were just mentioned language, to this, where a piece of language is very, very important, right? Because what we have here, again, in a certain interesting way, is a juxtaposition of an image and a sentence. And the sentence in French says, "This is not a pipe." So I was going to ask you, where does our sense of discomfort come from in viewing this painting, assuming that you have it? If you don't, you can say you're not at all uncomfortable. But I assume you look at it, there's some, they call it frisson, some sort of tension, at least, in viewing it. Well, is the state?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Are we allowed? Are you inviting us to share? Or
Yes,
okay,
I am.
Yeah, I think it's the ambiguity around the word "this," because we don't know what this is referring to. Is it referring to the painting, the sentence? Is it referring to the actual image? It's kind of it feels sort of dissonant when we read the sentence.
Yeah, philosophers call the word "this" an indexical, and you only get to understand what it means through the context in which it's used. And here it's bizarre because we don't know exactly what context Magritte had in mind when he painted that sentence.
Marilyn, jump in.
I guess maybe also the tension is, I guess if we're gonna deconstruct the sentence, the être, the to be, and then kind of moving back to what you were saying before with Plato, but like the ontological questions of what is the essence of something. And so we want to identify it, and we identify it as such, but then we're told that's not what it, like the true universal definition, that's not the thing. And so we have this toggling back and forth between trying to identify it and then realizing it's, it's an appearance of something, it's a mirage, and that the actual, universal truth of what the thing is that makes the thing is elusive, yet it's still referenced to.
Yeah. I mean, another way to think about it is to ask yourself, is that sentence true? This is not a pipe. If we take the "this" to refer to the image, is the sentence true? I mean, Christian's right that it's very ambiguous because it could be referring to the whole thing. It could be referring to the sentence itself. I mean, we don't know what the "this" refers to. So that the language is very different than the image. The language here is actually less precise, right? This isn't, the image is definitely an image of a pipe. It can't be an image of anything else. But one of the interesting things is that I think when people first look at it, they're sort of stunned that the sentence says this is not a pipe, because they say, well, what else? They think this refers to the image, and it's like, but it is a pipe, right?
Well, it's an image of a pipe.
It's
not a pipe.
It's an image of a pipe.
And Michael has added in the text, what is the "this"? In fact, is it the letters pointing to all the disparate material layers of the sign?
So so it's I mean, part of what's disturbing, I mean, I think for this to work, I think in all Magritte is a surrealist also, and in all of his paintings, there's elements of the things don't fit together quite right. If you know any of his other paintings, he does not normally use a sentence, but he just has images, and the images are disturbing in one way or another. And here it's interesting because you have a sense in which the image and the sentence are contradicting each other. But standardly philosophers don't think of images as able to contradict a sentence. Only sentences can make assertions and contradict each other. And here's an artist saying, well, maybe images do have a sort of assertional force, assertoric force. They can make claims, and it's because they can make claims that the sentence is so problematic. All right, so let's.
Nikki, did you want to jump in?
Well, I think in both cases, being somebody who makes objects, I think in the previous work, the chair, like we're looking at reproductions of these works. This is always challenging when you're teaching students also who might not have experience looking at work in the real. But the chair in the previous work invites you to imagine the physical body in the chair also. There's a corporal kind of extension of the understanding because it is actually artwork beyond philosophy. And I would sort of suggest that the painting's an object, the pipe is an object, the sentence is language. So it sort of plays also with that idea, the physicality of the work, which is hard for us, not only are we looking at a reproduction, we're also virtually looking at it. So the layers just become more and more infinite through this as you've suggested, you know, like what are all these different pieces? But I think there is a physical component when the artist is making the work, that it'll exist in the world. And then all those entries, the viewer will, you know, project their own physicality into the work in a way.
Yeah, and it also, you know, will make, as you start talking about it, you say, it's just a picture or a painted pipe, it's not a real pipe. And so you immediately get into the question of what makes something real and what's the difference between a painted pipe and a real pipe and a sentence about a pipe. And so it's all those.
Sorry, I was going to say that Rachel adds the further addition, reminding us that that pipe in French is slang for the male anatomy. So there's that added
Right.
level as well.
brings
And
us-
Mari, I believe you wanted to jump in.
I just put my my question in chat. I think the pipe itself is like so beautifully alluring and lustrous, and I just wondered about the relationship between that and these ideas. Like, why represent the pipe could have been presented visually in many ways, and I wondered if you had thoughts about that.
Well, I think it's because the pipe looks so realistic, in part, that it makes it difficult to just assent to the idea that it's not a pipe, because it presents, it's such a beautifully artistically rendered image of a pipe, or painting of a pipe, which is true that we only get to see here in a reproduction, but you can still see the qualities of it. And I think they really are important to, you know, it would be a very different thing if you just had a sort of drawing, you know, a drawing of a pipe with that sentence underneath it, because it wouldn't convey the sort of realism of the object in the way that this painting does. I mean, that's what I would say. But since we're talking about male anatomy, maybe we should get here. So this work is by Marcel Duchamp. It's even earlier than the last one, 1917. So it's not actually, you know, in the smaller sense, conceptual art, but this was a very, very important work in the history of 20th century art. It really made a big impact. And just to say a little bit about it, that you know, a lot of art that you see, there are exhibitions, and particularly this is particularly true, I think, in France, where people submit work to juried exhibitions, and then the jurors decide whether the work will be exhibited or not. And so Duchamp just took an industrial, you know, I don't know where he went, but he went to some hardware store or plumbing store, and he got a urinal, and he mounted it. You can't, this is a weird picture of it, but this part down here is a pedestal. So it's mounted on a pedestal. And I don't know what this background is, but it's not part of the work, okay? It's part of the way in which it was photographed. And then he signed it, Armut, which I think is a reference to the company that made the urinal, in 1917 is the date. And so he submitted it and it was rejected, which I think he knew would happen. But it caused a furor. And so, you know, if we're thinking of conceptual art as always having a concept, what do you think the concept behind Fountain is?
Jim, would you like to jump in with the comment you posted on chat? Well, maybe I can read it. Jim says, when my students first saw this 2 to 3 years ago, they said the artist had made a joke. And since they mostly felt the purpose of art was to communicate emotions, they labeled it a success.
What do you think about that?
Patricia, your hand is up. Do you want to respond? Oh, let's see. I'm going to unmute you, Patricia.
Oh, thank you. The only thing I can think of is that it's a elaborate social construct for a basic need.
Yeah, so I mean, there have been a lot of different ways of interpreting this. In this picture, you can't really see it, but you know, it's porcelain, and I don't actually know. I should have looked this up, what the history of the development of porcelain was, but it's incredibly shiny. You know, it's a manufactured object, but it's very shiny, and when the light hits it, it actually has a certain beauty to it. So some people said, well, Duchamp was just trying to show that ordinary objects can have the sort of properties that we traditionally associate with works of art. So like if you think about the David painting, The Death of Socrates, you think, well, that's a beautiful painting. Well, he's saying this art is beautiful too. That's what some people think. Then other people think it's more of a sort of political comment. And it can easily, you know, I think the fact that he chose the question is, okay, so he wanted to show that ordinary objects, manufactured objects, can have a sort of beauty that we traditionally only associate with paintings. He could have chosen any, you know, why did he choose a urinal? A urinal which is associated with, you know, urination and therefore, I mean, it's male, but it's also, you know, it's things that we excrete, and generally, you know, people don't, you know, I'm sure the people who looked at this thought like, is he kidding us? You know, is he kidding us? You know, he's actually going to ask us to display a urinal? You know, that they belong in bathrooms where people don't go, not out in the front of the hall. So in that sense, it was seen by some people as a critique of art and the sort of way in which exhibitions had become commercialized, and he was just sort of thumbing his nose at the establishment. But then a third possibility was put forward by Arthur Danto, who was a philosopher at Columbia University, who also was the art critic for The Nation magazine, and a very influential person in the philosophy of art. He thought that what Duchamp was saying is anything can be art, that there's no specific visual qualities that something has to have to qualify it as a work of art, that so long as it bore a certain significance, a certain meaning, it would count as art. And so I'm going to actually show you a similar sort of piece, and that is a piece of conceptual art by Andy Warhol from 1964, which is called Brillo Soap Pads Box. And what Warhol did, so I don't know if you know, so Brillo soap pads were a very popular brand. They probably still are a popular brand of soap pad. And what Warhol did, I think he was struck by the fact that this is one of the archetypical instances of commercial art, right? This box was designed by an abstract expressionist painter who, to support himself, had to work as a commercial artist. And at the time it was made, abstract expressionism was the reigning art form, right? That was like serious art was, you know, Jackson Pollock, say. And so what Warhol did was he didn't take the carton and from the grocery store and just display it as art. He actually constructed wooden replicas of the cardboard box that was in the grocery storage barn, and he silk screened them, actually sort of carelessly. You can't tell in this picture, but when you actually look at them, you can tell that they're not the real thing. And he displayed them in multiple copies. I don't know in the original, it was the Stable Gallery in New York, and I don't know exactly how many. There were a lot of Brillo boxes there. You could have made a killing if you bought one, but nobody did. And so Danto says that here, that what Warhol is doing is showing that anything can be a work of art, right? You can take an ordinary thing, put it in a sort of museum context, and it becomes a work of art. And the reason, and what's the concept? The concept is just that, right? That philosophers have misunderstood the nature of art by trying to find some essence or some visual, some property that distinguishes artworks from all the other things in the world. And what Danto said Warhol discovered and wanted us to see, and also earlier Duchamp, is that there is no sort of distinctive feature that makes things work of art, that they don't have to communicate emotions. They don't have to be beautiful. They just have to have some, and the question, some idea and some relevance to the history of art to be considered art. So, if there are no comments, then I'll just sort of quickly go through. I think we're running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly give some conclusions about conceptual art. So conceptual art is fundamentally different than traditional art, which had to do with creating beautiful objects, as we saw in the Death of Socrates. There are other theories like the expression of emotion or the communication of emotion that was mentioned earlier. That's not what conceptual art's about either. So it's really an art form that's critical of philosophical theories of art. We saw the critique of Plato, but there's other ones too. It presents viewers with a puzzle of sorts, because you have to ask yourself, what is the concept or idea that the artist is trying to communicate through the work? And of course, just like as we saw in the sentence, "This is not a pipe," there's no context that we know, right? That we have to sort of struggle to find the appropriate context to use in understanding the work. And that's not easy. Conceptual art also requires us to readjust our assumptions about art, because we have to encompass this genre of art that seems very different from our more traditional understandings of what art is. And that despite what Plato says about being limited to appearances of appearances, the conceptual artist is saying, no, art can express ideas. And in fact, that's its point. That it's not just, philosophy isn't the only place where ideas are important. And it actually poses the question of whether all art isn't about the ideas. So if we go back to the David piece, maybe he's making this around the time of the French Revolution. Why is he using Socrates and the death of Socrates? Is he talking about the terror? I mean, I don't know actually the specifics of what that piece was about, but I think what a conceptual artist would do is always try to look and find the ideas and ask about what ideas are at play in art, because I think they want to say that really art is much more about ideas than people have understood. So anyway, we are now definitely out of time, and I'll be quiet. You want to have time for everybody to talk among themselves.
Excellent. So we are going to have a moment here to send you off into small groups again. But I wonder if there is one question among the group that we should take before you go off into. Does anybody have a question that's been welling up and you'd like to pose it before we go off into small groups? All right. Well, for those of you who have been watching this presentation via live stream, thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed it.